This mapping of Wall Street forest ownership, what I did in 2016, is really a revisit of something I did in 1995 of analyzing every county's data for who owns the place and looking at who the industrial owners are. Only this time I had the benefit of GIS and a little easier to use software, and then coded those owners that we knew to be Wall Street associated. Now, under Wall Street, it was quite clear that they're growing money. They're not growing trees, they're not growing forests, they're growing money. Up until about 2015, I was working for the Coast Range Association on day in and day out work. And you pretty much have to do a lot of things that are just what the conservation community is up to. The Western Oregon BLM planning for 8, 9, 10 years was on and off. And about 2015, I kind of retired from feeling like I had to work on the day in and day out stuff and stay in contact with my colleagues. And that's when I decided to revisit the ownership of Western Oregon and look at taxes, which is more something I wanted to do than the conservation community was on that program. So the work that I've done since then, and what you're going to see tonight, is a thread of work that I've done since about 2015, up until this week when we finished up this latest report, and I should have it on the website, but I don't work like in the old days, so I'll get it up on the website by the end of this week, I'm sure. And Michael Gaskell does work for us, and there's other people that have certain agendas. But what you're going to get is the agenda that I've worked on for the past 8 years. And I spoke here January 11th, I think 2018. And we'll take a look at that. I've put it into the slideshow, the poster for that. I want to start off with this picture of where I grew up. And in that red circle was my house. And when I was about 9, the Eisenhower Expressway opened up to traffic and was finished being built. And I spent the next 10 years 3 doors down from one of the busiest highways in Cook County, Chicago, in the era of leaded gas. I would be a lot smarter today than I am if I hadn't have spent 10 years breathing all those fumes of leaded gas. But my point here also is that when I was young, I looked out on a farm with cornfields and orchards. And this is kind of how it looked when I left at age 21 to never return. If we think back to the era of 500 years and the earth being basically under the growth and domination of capitalism, and if we assume some sort of growth every year, I don't know, say 5% a year. One of the things about compound growth, and I think what I experienced here, is that half of all the growth, if the compound rate is 5%, half of all the growth that has ever occurred under the capitalist system, all the steel mills, all the coals mined, everything that is all around the earth today, half of it happened since the year 2000. People never see it coming in a compound growth doubling situation. And that's where we're at, and I'm going to bring that up a few times in my presentation. But that thought of, actually it was the end of the slideshow, and I was thinking about capitalism that brought me back to this first slide. So let's get going. In the presentation and in my thoughts and work for the past 8 years, actually the past 30 years, the extinction crisis is really what got me into the environmental conservation movement. The Northwest Forest Plan, the protection of old growth forests, or native forest, was all about a growing awareness of extinction across the planet. So this was something right from the beginning, and it has driven everything that I've thought about for the past 30 years as a career conservationist. But it also has to do much more than anything I work on here in Oregon. It really goes to the mega machine that engulfs the planet of energy, machines, fertilizers, pesticides that are just, the planet is dosed with. So that's one. The social crises increasingly became something that came on my screen over the past 30 years as I did this work. And you'd focus on native forest or streams or the aquatic conservation strategy of the Northwest Forest Plan or whatever. And these social crises always seemed to be something I cared about, something I thought about, and something my colleagues really didn't know about or care about. With some of them actually thinking that if people disappeared, it would be for the better. So this always kind of caused me to wonder. And the climate crisis, of course, is what has motivated a lot of the work in the past 5 years. And so these three themes or three phenomena are really kind of braided together into the work that I do. There's a slide that I put together for the PILC conference, and that is just a modeling of Pacific Northwest forest under one of the more unfortunate scenarios of the IPCC. I think we're headed for a lot of big change in the next 60 years in the Pacific Northwest in terms of forest, and you got to wonder, what's really going to happen? Where are we going? Where will the watersheds go? I've used this. This might have been in the slideshow I did here. Maybe not. I think I added this after I spoke here in 2018, and this was really about the climate crisis. And it's a slide that I use to illustrate the sense of urgency we all should be operating under. And that is EMTs, they arrive at an accident scene, they execute what needs to be done. They do it, everything moves fast, things are taken care of. The political economy, our political leaders, whatever we call it, the power structure, should be operating like this right now. It's not like they don't know what to do. They do. Many of them consciously do not want to do it and confound trying to do it. And then we end up with this kind of political situation where the place is on fire, but let's still golf. I think golf is the game of the ruling class, I believe. Yeah. You know, they like to be out there hitting the ball around. What is that about? I don't know. My dad was an avid golfer. I never did understand it. But I do understand when the hill's on fire. I wouldn't be golfing. We finished up a COP, 27 recently. It was a big disappointment. What was it, held in Dubai or something? In the Middle East. The world promised to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Subsidies. We're not talking about fossil fuels. We're talking about the subsidies. Phase it out instead of double them. Now, there's all kinds of rigmarole to be argued, the war in Ukraine, the Russian gas, blah, blah, blah. But that's always going to be the case. This mapping of Wall Street forest ownership, what I did in 2016, is really a revisit of something I did in 1995 of analyzing every county's data for who owns the place and looking at who the industrial owners are. Only this time I had the benefit of GIS and a little easier to use software, and then coded those owners that we knew to be Wall Street associated, which I'll explain in a minute. And this phase is where I revisited more deeply the idea, because we had real estate investment trusts now owning more than half the land, or timber investment management organizations. So Wall Street capital was here directly involved in ownership. And so we were looking at financial forest management, something that I had studied for the previous 15 years. And except now, under Wall Street, it was quite clear that they're growing money. They're not growing trees, they're not growing forests, they're growing money. And that's what it's all about. And that's what it's all about across the western part of the state. And it's not really talked about. It's not part of the narrative of the dominant political culture. They pretend they've got other narrative. And so, this was a slide we did. Actually, we did this a long time ago, but about 2017, 2018, climate is arriving big time. So I'm trying to think about how do you synthesize the financial Wall Street problem with forest ownership and climate. Now, one of the ways to look at it is native forest on top, and that's to scale. That's what if the native forest scaled on the top like that, industrial plantation scale on the bottom. And obviously the difference is carbon in the atmosphere, or carbon maybe still in homes, but mostly in the atmosphere. So it wasn't hard to put together a story about let's not do the Wall Street grow money forestry anymore. Let's look at a different kind of forest. We're not going to go back to native forest on the industrial lands, so what would be the appropriate thing for industrial lands? And this is where I was thinking about all this and putting something together, and that's when I spoke here. That's where the story ended when I spoke here, which was 1/11/2018. Now, I could have quit working and just left it at that. We had nice maps. I had a good story railing on Wall Street and Forest. But no, I kept working. And we did a few other things. So given the climate narrative of that period, which was the Green New Deal, House Resolution 109, which made a real strong play to justice themes, we got together and talked and synthesized a climate, forest, and justice narrative into a proposal and an analysis of the industrial Wall Street lands. And it's in that document, and you can download it from the Coast Range website and read it. I think it's a pretty good argument. We kind of rolled that out, and COVID hit. So it was kind of like, it was fairly odd period for trying to promote something. But there's now a renewed interest, I know, in Green New Deal thinking and stuff. So I will think I want to roll that out and push it a little bit more. But one of the two things in it, in the synthesis of themes, was land reform and the call for the end of Wall Street ownership of land and the conversion of that land. Yeah, I mean, that's not anything that the conservation movement has talked about. I mean, it's not something that, Audubon Society would say, oh, well, the birds need the land. Let's kick Wall Street out. They don't go there. Land reform was explored. The other thing we explored was the conversion of corporate ownership to locally controlled entities, similar to co-ops that the electric distributors, 80% of America is served by owner co-ops, which not a lot of people are familiar with. It's that extensive. So between that and the land reform, that was what was new in this document. And why land reform? You could make any number of reasons, and I'll probably explore a few later, but the elite's constant destructive search to maximize profits is really what's going on out there. And you really have to change the ownership of the property to get out from under that problem on forests.
There's a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've used the fiduciary argument in the past, but I think it goes deeper than a fiduciary thing. I think it has to do with who they are as just human animals that own large pools of capital and live in that world. They're just predators. And, you know, they got all the rigmarole, and they hire all the people to write narrative that, you know, glosses over this and makes them look this way. But they're really a bunch of guys on a lot of testosterone just wanting to tear the shit out of everything. But let's not go down that hole. Oh, there's the social benefit working forest. I had my slide in the wrong place. Anyway, that's what we proposed, and that's worth a read. That proposal alone is what we proposed. And so I always stopped, since I started talking about the financial thing, and had to stop and talk about the economy in the world we live in, because this whole Wall Street ownership of forest doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a system. And this is my little thing I put together to illustrate the system, and that is wealth, the capital, is owned by somebody at the top. There's a distribution of wealth in this society. There's a fire sector in the economy that services this wealth. And the real economy of production and consumption, the communities, the places we live or might work, are all under this regime. And the whole regime is organized to get rents, interest, profits, or income flowing up to the owners of wealth. That's the system. And then when the owners of wealth have ocean liners full of cash, and just how much money do they have? There was $15 trillion parked in 0% savings or accounts over the past 10 years of easy money and low interest rates that the wealthy had, that just wanted to put it somewhere where it wouldn't get lost or stolen or burned. 15 trillion doing nothing. That's how much money. Now that's the money they just had to park. How much money is deployed and attacking us on a daily basis? That's, 80, 40, 60 trillion that's loose and organized and having us under attack. And so what they do when they got all this money is they sell it back to us as debt instruments, some form of debt. You want a mortgage on your house? Where does that money come from? You want to go to college and you want to get a loan? Where does that come from? Where does all the debt come from? It comes from the people with wealth. And the fire sector, the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, which in 2008, just before the meltdown and crash, probably 2007, was making 40% of all profits in the US economy. This little sector of people was making 40% of all the profits across the entire economy. And that's where they work. And what's puzzling about what they're all up to is because a lot of people don't know the nature of their game. It's not obvious what they're doing. It's not like the people running around with billions to buy and get and come into your community and buy homes and bid against you for a home. It's not like it's really obvious what they're doing. So it's really about invasive capital. That's what's been going on in the past 5 decades. Invading communities, invading new economic sectors that previously were off limits. The healthcare system being one of the biggest targets for invasion. And it's this massive amount of money owned by the people with money with their fire sector agents that are invading communities, invading economic sectors, invading all over the world. I mean, you think we got it rough. The rest of the world is under literal siege. And we see it every day in all the sci-fi movies. A lot of these movies are explicitly written by screenwriters who don't like capitalism and don't like the invasions. And they just write movies that illustrate that using people from outer space. And that's what Independence Day was all about. The capitalists showing up and blowing your town right out of the water. And of course, they have all kinds of people to create narratives that it's creative destruction, that this is for our own good, and this is for the good of society. This is progress. Blah, blah, blah. Endless threads of bullshit, turning night into day into night, black into white, white into black. Whatever's going on, they'll reverse the story. I saw this, when I was putting this together about a month before. This was just in the Guardian one day, and I've got another one since I put the slideshow together of another invasion, which it's too late at night. It escapes my mind. But I mean, what area? How can we use this money to invade and make a buck? And here's the allocation of wealth in the United States. So we got the top 10% with 92. This is net wealth, okay? So they got more wealth than 92 trillion, but this is their on the plus side. The 39 trillion owned by the 40% of the Americans or the US people is basically tied up in home ownership. It's not deployable wealth. It's not something they can launch against somebody else. It's tied up wealth. The people on the bottom 50% with 5 trillion, I think in 2017 or 16, they had a negative net worth. But since the pandemic and all this money being pumped out, some real estate values going up, they've gone into the positive. So 50% of the U.S. has 5 trillion in wealth. And for the moment, 92 trillion for the top 10%, and the top 1% has 41 trillion of that 92. That percent has 41 trillion that is bombing things. They are the people that are launching the attack of wealth. Another way of looking at it. Yeah, you just can't, I build these things and I stare at them and I think, what am I going to say? You could say a lot. The U.S. society obviously has a structure, an operation. It operates in some fashion. There's lots of books about it. It has a ruling elite. It has a media machine that manufactures consent. It has a dominant culture. I mean, if you look at your typical family on television, at least as I used to watch it, I haven't seen television in a long time. It was always an upper middle class look. Right. It was the look of someone in the 10%, not the 1%. They look great. They got a nice house. They're buying. They got stuff. They're doing things. Maybe they be in the top of the 40% too. And that's what's sold. And that star on the bottom right, I actually had it in this slideshow, a number of stars where I would stop at the pill thing and I'd say, we could do a whole workshop on just this topic. We spent 4 hours just visiting the U.S. culture, ruling elite, and media system and what it's up to. So after this, period here of this synthesis, I pivoted and started looking at let's look at the rural economy a little closer. I was fascinated drilling into the corporate machine. We did a population study from comparing the census tracts in communities between 1990 and 2000. Now, unless it might not be apparent what you're looking at, but what you're looking at is all this white area and all this gray area, which is to say all the rural area. It's got tepid population growth over those 30 years or population loss. And that is an economy designed at the top for the wealthy, for an economy that services whatever it services. But what it doesn't service is the rural America. And in Western Oregon, I think there's a real good reason why you want a declining rural area, is because you drain people out of the rural area and you've got less people complaining about the helicopter spray. You've got less people complaining about the domination of logging equipment and stuff like that. There's a whole story there. That'd be a whole workshop just talking about the rural economy, I would say. This Daily Yonder piece, this is a really modest liberal outfit, the Daily Yonder, but it's about rural, kind of liberal perspective on rural systems. I thought this headline, Mark Edelman, been reading a little of his stuff. He's got a nice essay about systematically stripping away assets by the people with wealth. So this is what we just finished up. I've got it proofed. I have it on a thumb drive. If you actually had to leave with it tonight, I could give it to you on a thumb drive, but we're going to have it on the Coast Range website, hopefully by this week. And it's a follow the money of Oregon's timber companies. And I did two things here that I hadn't seen before, and that is looking at, so all the sales dollars of the timber industry, it's like something like 64 billion since the early 90s, or since the 2010 or whatever, 2008, about 23 billion. So the question is, all the industrials sell the timber, and they have to pay the cost of production, the other expenses in the company, taxes and interest that then come, and then you have profits. This is the standard four levels of a company's income and expenses. Well, what I wanted to see is, as the money goes out, where does it go? What goes rural, what goes urban, and what goes out of state? No, I'd never seen that talked about before. Now you might say, well, cost of production, which is about 65–70% of the sales dollar, you might say, oh, well, it's loggers, log truck drivers. But when you got a big $500,000 machine that's leased, and you're making those big lease payments, who's getting the lease payment? Who provided the money for the lease? The 1%. So actually, a lot of money in the cost of production is going to the wealthy in terms of bank loans, lease payments, or rich subcontractors that make quite a bit on a good year. So I don't know. I don't have hard numbers for how it works, but you have to think this through to where the money's actually going. Other expenses, technicals, professionals, lawyers, lobbyists, everything Weyerhaeuser or another big company would have. Those folks are making a lot of money. They're part of the 10%. Now, REITs don't pay taxes. So what they've got, Weyerhaeuser, I know, has a $6 billion in debt, corporate debt, that are bonds. Who owns bonds? Well, the structure of equity and debt like that, we know who owns bonds. 60% of that kind of equity is owned by the 1%. So you just know 60% of what Weyerhaeuser's paying on their bonds is going to the 1%. The degree that our forest lands are used for money. So here's the question. The degree, yeah, well, here, let's just move on to the next one. So who gets the money? That's the other question I asked in this study. Western Oregon's millions of private acres are basically sending a boatload of money to the 1%. You could say, particularly the profits. Who gets the profits? We know the structure of ownership of stocks, equities, and those kinds of things. 90% by the top 10%, 60% by the top 1%. So all the profits on a good year are basically going to that elite, and they're getting more money. And the thing about money that flows to here is that they get money they don't need, so they get to use it and save it. But the money going down here is all spent on just living and surviving. You never build up a nest egg to do anything with it. So it's really interesting to look at how the whole thing is structured. To try and understand this, I'm studying the Code of Capital by Katharina Pister, a professor at Columbia. And I want to understand how this land, firms, debt, and know-how all works under these regimes of law. All law happens under states and their coercive power. Without the coercive power, the law won't work. So the whole system is rigged to wire us up by high-powered lawyers in all kinds of ways. And who's ever read the damn thing you signed to get some software or internet service? Do you know what that says? That's the legal entrapment of this whole body of capital and property that is deployed over our lives and we're embedded in. And the funny thing is that the system is called capitalism, and the right wing has all kinds of books telling us it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. You know, capitalism's great. Oh, capitalism has a flaw, but if it could just be allowed to work correctly, we would just be in heaven. And then there's the critical books. But what's kind of interesting is as much as there's written about capitalism, because it happens to be the system we have, you never hear it talked about. I never heard a conservation person in 30 years interpret the BLM planning, forest this, that, whatever, hardly, by an intelligent exposition of capitalism. I don't know. Something is going on here. Now, this is who I'm reading now. Has anyone read Anwar? I never even heard of him. Jesus de Cristo. I'm telling you, 2017, 1,000 pages. He's a professor at the New School in New York, got a PhD in economics at Columbia. James Galbraith, who's someone I follow, sometimes I've even had some correspondence with him, the economist at Texas, gives a statement on the back of the book, a book we've been waiting for 150 years. This is a mind-boggling exposition of economics, synthesizing Marx, Keynes, and with a full understanding of the neoclassical dogshit economics. The man is just brilliant, and I'm trying to get through this book. A lot of it I don't understand. I can't do the math. There's a lot of math in there. But this is validating. I haven't read anything that hasn't validated everything I knew, suspected, or said without a citation, which I have a tendency to do. So anyway, I'm working on Anwar and Katharina Pfister's books. And the solution, we've got to have a solution. We're under attack by capital and its exploitive tendencies, its political organization of our communities, or the non-organization, just domination. People all across the world aren't under attacks of exploitation. They're under physical attacks by militaries to expropriate what they own, the land they have, etc. So we've got it relatively easy compared to just millions and millions of square miles across the planet. But here's the thing, if you go back to the beginning, I don't think we're going to reform our way out of this one. We're dug in pretty deep, and this climate crisis is like a turbocharger on a big engine, if we wanted to use a gearhead metaphor. The extinction crisis, young people don't realize the goalposts have been moved. The birds aren't there. The fish aren't there. They come into consciousness and go, oh, listen to all those birds. Well, you should have been there in 1955. There was a shit ton more birds. Half of all animals are now gone. So they're just not there chirping or barking or whatever happens. The social crisis just keeps spreading and deepening. And the climate crisis, I think, has got to be the one that calls, it's like playing poker. I call your hand. Put your cards down. Thanks.